It has been noted that in the age of global capitalism, virtually everything is for sale. Nothing lies outside the reach of the market. Today, education is increasingly instrumental, a means to an end known as the so-called good life. Squeezed between the demands of capital and budgetary shortfalls, the global priests of education in turn demand ever greater sacrifices from students, such that universities that were once sites for the production of knowledge aimed toward the common good have now become territories of capitalist reproduction, which has led to the creation of an entire generation of indoctrinated, indentured, and thus largely depoliticized subjects. We live in an age where the Sophists are the chief philosophers, where the Socratic injunction to know thyself is transposed such that the means by which we now make ourselves known is a twin inscription upon a capitalist surface. It is at once prescription and postscript, whereby desire congeals in collective ritual consumption, as well as one's marking of various promissory notes, which signal an individual's desire for absorption within the capitalist matrix. We have misplaced our hope into an asymmetrical covenant with an abstraction that cannot make good on its promises. Thus, for those coming under the weight of massive student debt, these promises and hopes have begun to ring hollow. The promise of the good life, it seems, does not come without a significant price tag. The true cost becomes more apparent with each decade that passes, for many persisting into old age until, finally, receiving a new tag, one that hangs solemnly from the naked toe. The revolution Marx envisioned will likely never come. Indeed, where today are the proletariat, the vanguards? Are they the ones we see smashing windows, punching Nazis, or wearing pussy hats? Perhaps it has always been the case that revolution has hidden itself in the modest form of a seed. Today, strategies aimed towards authentic change must extend beyond the tiresome and endless barrage of criticism, which often functions to merely reconstitute the world as it is. Education must now begin with the question of one's own willing participation in false consciousness. This is at once a political and a spiritual discipline. It is from here that we might begin the task of imagining a new collective paradigm. But this should not be misconstrued as a new form of enlightenment, but rather as a form of endarkening, a case of strange and sudden blindness where together we may yet learn to see in the dark, to feel our way forward. A catacomic ethos resists the commodification of our very souls. When we withdraw from the effort of self-making, from engaging in a hermeneutics of the self a la Foucault, the sign of the skull no longer indicates hope or the possibility of new life, but becomes merely the expression of a ghastly and cartoonish aesthetic where death becomes us. Is it true? Are we unable to imagine another world in light of what we are witnessing today? And must we go it alone, or might we traverse this abyss together? As a subterranean refuge for constructive theology, the catacombs present a horizontal ascent. Not a way out, but a way in. The functional binary between the catacombs and the cathedrals places two paths before us, one of death in life, the other of life in death. In this episode, Preston Price and I speak to Creston Davis, who is the founder and director of the GCAS, the Global Center for Advanced Studies. He's also a writer and editor of some pretty well-known texts, along with GZEC and Milbank, a couple of which you're probably familiar with, most notably Paul's New Moment and The Monstrosity of Christ. We don't end up talking about his work with them too much, but this was a fun conversation where we covered a lot of ground, actually. Creston is an interesting guy with an interesting and inspiring project that you'll hear more about. In this episode, you'll also hear sound design by one of our new friends, Jacob Andrade, which, if I've mispronounced, I apologize. We hope that you'll connect with us. We're continuing to post to our website somewhat regularly, as well as our social media channels on Facebook. We can be found there, as well as on Twitter at Catacomb Machine. If you're interested in contributing to this project, let us know and we'll talk more. Anyway, here's Creston Davis.
When you do something different, it's a weird thing in our psychology, I think, social psychology, where, I think that people there's rage, there's thanatos, there's jealousy, and then, conservatives especially came after me and thinking I was a communist. And I'm not a communist. I've never claimed to be a communist or any kind of big ideology, but, it was seen as a kind of threatening in some way. And even the privileged left, and there's plenty of them, who are locked away in their posh jobs making $150,000 a year, writing radical books, but they drive around their Mercedes-Benz. This also poses threats when you create an alternative that's trying to alleviate us from indenturedness to corporations, banks, and so on.
Yeah, if nothing else, it breeds cynicism.
Absolutely. Are we recording? By the way, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What's the meaning of this program? Like the name? What's that all mean?
Do you want to give a shot at that, Matt? Do you have any quantifications on that?
Yeah, I probably won't do a great job with it. But the catacomic machine, the machine is sort of a giveaway, isn't it? That's sort of a Deleuzian-minded project, right? So the machinic points to the idea of production and of producing effects, such that the catacomic machine names a project that is a creative space. And the catacombs is a way of sort of invoking a dualism between the catacombs and the cathedrals as two different ways of doing theology. Of course, the dualism in itself is a construction, but it's a useful one for sort of parsing out some of these different ways of thinking theologically after the death of God.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
You follow the wake of, I hear Nietzsche there, the death of God invocation, which actually really attributed to Hegel. And William Desmond told me about this, the great Hegel scholar from Ireland. And you invoke Nietzsche, and I hear Deleuze there. That's interesting. That's curious. The catacombs underground, you're kind of in a cave-like space, and at the same time, the cathedral, which is this sort of, elevated space of awe, and very inspiring. So that's interesting. You're mixing up these spaces.
Yeah, that's true, I think. And I think also the catacombs is, maybe there's sort of a epistemology of darkness to kind of invoke Winquist there, because catacomic theology is a desiring theology of becoming.
So the moment is in a birthing process of becoming, and not in a completed triumphalistic end game that we already know. We hold truth in our hands, we hold the absolute, and we proclaim the absolute over against heresy, in any opposition. That's fascinating, that it's a process of becoming. That's interesting to me.
I call it a subterranean refuge for constructive theology, in a sense. It's just a place
Wait, can you repeat that?
Say that again? That sounded good.
Yeah, sorry. It's a subterranean refuge for constructive theology.
So it's subterranean. It's below a surface. It's a refuge. Things that are below surfaces, are called graves.
Yeah, but they were also places of refuge for Christians being persecuted under the Roman Empire.
Man, I'll share with you an experience I had that was forever impactful, and I go back to it time and again. When I was in Turkey visiting the Cappadocian mountains, there's like 10,000 churches carved into this soft rock, and it's unbelievable how you can go into one worship space and into another. And as you're walking through it, invariably you're walking literally on the graves of people. that were buried in the rock. And for me, that hollowed space of death and worship and the sound, the acoustics, all that together was extremely different experience for me than anything I've ever known in practicing Christianity. And I was a pastor at one point. And, to think that you're going to ask people to come to worship Jesus and to do that by walking over people's graves, literally walking on top of people's, who were buried, is something that's completely, I think, outside the mindset of an American suburban mindset of Christianity.
And that's an interesting way of putting that. If we kind of go back to the catacombs and the cathedrals, I mean, oftentimes, the cathedrals are built on top of the catacombs. It's what the cathedrals leave unthought, in a sense.
Yeah, it's almost like there's an eraser of the dead. There's a protection, between death and worship. Whereas I think the catacombs invokes a much more intimacy, interconnectivity between death and worship. And it's not like a kind of a sick, perverted idea of, oh yes, let's worship Jesus and be around dead people.
Right. There's an aesthetic for sure, but it's not the point necessarily.
That's a good way to frame it. Yeah. Totally.
Well, I think, just on that note, but death is also a tool for remembrance. When we take the communion, when we take the Eucharist, what are we remembering? We're remembering Christ's life, but also his death, his body broken for us, his blood poured out for us, in a sense. So there's that connection between the sacrality of life, but also it's not disconnected from the sacrality of death, in a sense. Not that death in itself is sacred. Yeah. I think that there's something in that kind of that theory, that universal understanding of experiencing finitude that even non-theists can really resonate with, I think. Symbolic death. Zizek talks a lot about symbolic death, a lot in his works that I've read. And he talks about this notion of that symbolic death is almost just as fearful, I think, for a lot of people as maybe actual physical finitude, because when you lose your community, which gets back to this notion of refuge, a subterranean refuge, when you lose your community, that kind of symbolic tragedy, if it is, or symbolic death, is an experience of finitude as well. You experience your social finitude.
You couldn't have put it in a better way. I mean, and invoking this kind of notion of psychoanalysis where you have, the symbolic order, and once the linguistic order that arranges your subjectivity is erased or compromised, this is precisely the recipe of psychosis, right? Where suddenly everything, I don't know if you remember the woman who was a news anchor who literally had a brain blip, and she was speaking nonsensically live on television. I don't know if you remember that a couple of months ago, I think.
CBS 2's Serene Branson is live at the Staples Center with highlights and backstage coverage we're seeing for the very first time. Serene.
Well, a very, very heavy divertation tonight. We had a very Darrison by, let's go ahead, Terrace Chase English for the bit, to have the pit.
In any case, the whole point is like, you're right, the symbolic death, the disruption and rupture of the symbolic order can, in fact, rearrange one's own being in much more profound ways than I think potentially death itself. And this is what Marcus Pound, my good friend, talks about in his book on psychoanalysis and trauma, where he argues that in fact Eucharist is an eruption of the real in the Lacanian terms that disrupts the symbolic relation and order. So when you're participating in that, it actually is a kind of when Christians participate in the sacrament of this Last Supper or Communion Eucharist, there's literally a kind of participation in one's own subjective dissolution. And the trauma of that, and what I miss, and I haven't practiced Christianity in 5 years more, but what I miss about one of the most profound rituals in Christianity to me, and this relates to what we're talking about, is Ash Wednesday, when it's the only time in a consumer-driven culture where everything's about me, fucking me, that you get ashes put on your forehead and you're told to your face that you will die and you are nothing but ashes. And that's really radical. I mean, there's a shock. I would take my friends to Ash Wednesday services when I was at Oxford as an undergrad, and they were just literally shocked. Like a female friend of mine at the time, I forget her name, Laurel, and she was like in shock mode for the day. It was like, because you were told from ashes you come and to ashes you go. This is disrupting the symbolic.
Mm-hmm. But I think that disruption is there's this notion of the event that is used a lot in contemporary philosophy. I mean, Badiou talks about it. I'm most familiar with his notion of the event. Zizek wrote a book recently about the event. But that disruption is an event. It's something that you cannot. It's the event of the real breaking into our ordinary rituals or institutions, and that made me. When you were talking about the news anchor who lost a certain sense, had a brain blip, and lost the ability to speak within the symbolic order. Not only does she lose a sense of herself within that symbolic order, but the people who are watching the news, the cameramen, the sound men and women, they also lost a sense of the symbolic order. And see, this connects to the GCAS for me, because if you want to, I'll try to connect you here, because the GCAS is the disruption of the real into the symbolic order of the educational institutions, in a sense, because it's calling into question the very notion that of what the institutions are founded upon, about massive indebtedness, this idea that you need to go to school as a doctor not as a doctor, as a physical doctor. You need to go to school a long time for that, but just to get a doctorate in philosophy or the humanities for 5 to 7 years or more, depending upon when you get your dissertation. I think that the Global Center for Advanced Studies actually allows us to rethink what it means to be a student, what it means to be an educator, what it means to what the value of education is. So.
Yeah, I appreciate making that connection. I can't have to say, it's been an incredible struggle to create a different space outside being funded by, because it's all about following the money, and at the same time, I like to think in my utopian fashion that something special will happen irrespective of the capitalist order. So at a certain point, we're trying to resist, or at least call into question, the notion that you have to pay to learn. And at the same time, we have to figure out a way of keeping our website going, of keeping the basic structure going, the venue, and so on. And these are the struggles. In the end, when I was teaching at Rollins College for many years, I just couldn't deal with students coming to learn about how to live a good life. Mm-hmm. How to emancipate oneself from the troubles of youth, of their father saying you suck, of the troubles of what it means to work and to produce a happy life, to try to figure out a way of liberating ourselves from the commodification, the fetishization, and ultimately being a slave to the structure of what the world expects of us. And, to talk and teach on that level can be awesome, but to require your students to go into debt, to sign notes to the government or to banks, to sit in a classroom to learn about how to be liberated is a contradiction in terms, mm-hmm. right? And to me, I couldn't live with that. I had a hard time living with that.
Yeah, so maybe you can talk a little bit about what was going on in your thinking around that time and some of the struggles that you've sort of endured to launch this. And maybe you can say something about how it's been going, positive or negative things. Like I hear this thing you're saying, I think that nonprofits experience this sort of internal tension of how are we sort of resisting in a robust way, but yet still parasitic on capital, Yes. So maybe you can talk about some of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to put it when you just bouncing off of the last thing you said, corporations love to go offshore to evade taxes, which is basically treason. And, I was thinking a real rogue educational project would be located in the Cayman Islands where, right? Why can't the left, let's say,
I would enroll.
Yeah, a beer in the Caymans is like $18, but okay.
Oh.
Okay. Well,
We would be able to stay there for about a day. but hey, that's a good day. No, but like, these strategies, the international capital, I was talking to Michael Hart and Antonio Negri about this, these same kinds of ways that, transnational capital work to avoid regulation, to avoid their responsibility to the social good. Well, I was thinking we could use and steal some of these ways to actually, the channels to actually give back to the social good in 10,000 times fold, what would that look like? What would it look like? On the one hand, you have this problem when you start a new school of reputation where, why would anybody spend time getting a degree from an unknown place? Who knows what it could be? And on the other side, reputations of like really good schools, a diploma today is not worth as much as it was when I was 10 years old in 1980, So, it's trying to figure out these ways of putting together a different kind of project that has in mind a different hope for a world, a hope that, kind of invoking Bonhoeffer, a life together, where our demands for a life and joy and what we find the greatest pleasure tends to be repressed in just a very matrix of what it means to get up and make your coffee and ride your bike down to work and come back. What does it mean? And if nothing else, GCAS, or the Global Center for Advanced Studies, we say GCAS. It creates these different spaces where, and I can't tell you, you can romanticize it and all that, but being in these different spaces where the mode of production that has created the space itself is not corrupt. It's a mode of communal relationship has been, and learning within that space has been something that if you haven't ever experienced, and I don't think you can experience it in a traditional university setting, because there's so many things built into what it means to actually show up and walk through that posh space of a classroom, if it is in fact posh. So it's those kind of things of connecting up the immanence of a community with the experience of learning together in a process of you don't know where the hell it's going to go. And riding that kind of wave is something that has changed people. It changed me. It changes people that show up. Not everybody. I'm not romanticizing. And we have our problems. We're not solving the fucking problem. But we are at least trying to figure out different ways of connecting with each other. And no doubt, this is no doubt related to, my, in some ways, a theology. Because, when Christianity comes on the scene, first of all, it's extremely pluralistic. It's very diverse. And, orthodoxy was a process of getting rid of diversity and changing difference into identity. And when Christianity shows up on the scene, historically, you have this immense passion that's unleashed onto the world where in whether it's in a Jewish community or in the Greek community or whatever, you have this incredibly new flood of possibility. And, from Jesus, who talks about forgiveness, there's no Jew or Gentile, there's no male or female, there's this new universality. And there's spaces like that happen historically. And it's not, you can't manufacture it. To manufacture it is commodifying it. And, in some ways, we're trying to figure that out. We fail. But in some ways, sometimes there's this overwhelming sense of connectivity with with other human beings. And that's been, for me, the greatest blessing of living a life like that. Yeah, you don't have a mansion. You're not working to buy the summer home, to have the third car and the second dog. You're not concerned with the suburban, ladder where your dog barks because, the resentment that you have towards your neighbor doesn't have to be displayed through you. You have dogs to do that, and you have these complete different matrix of what it means. I don't know where it can go from there. And at the same time, the challenge for us is creating that institutionalization, not creating it, but having to have it, because we're going through a process of being accredited now through the European Union. Mm-hmm. And so you have this tension between this new thing and new space, and at the same time fitting into the pre-existing categories without trying to be domesticated. And that tension is challenging and difficult, but also, part of our survival.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear sort of the theological root sort of coming through as you speak in Tillichian terms. There's a sense of real ultimate concern when you talk about education that, I appreciate. Part of that, I think I hear in the background of what you're saying is there's sort of a overtone of hope, and I think is important, especially today, on the left, where it's too easy to kind of lapse into cynicism, as we mentioned earlier. I don't know. I mean, I know that word has sort of a bitter taste, at least for people here in the U.S. following Obama's, big hope campaign back whenever that was. But are there other places where you see hope today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it would be interesting to hear your response to that as well. I mean, when I was going through grad school, I would work at times volunteer at Catholic worker places or, soup kitchens, and in Atlanta, Church of the Open Door. When I was an undergrad, we would go down there. And, it's funny because the paradox is that, it's dirty, it's grimy, you're around dirty people. And at the same time, you find that it's the most meaningful, joyful activity that you could do. And, I'm a psychoanalyst, although I don't practice. But my analyst was Bruce Fink, and Bruce Fink is one of Lacanian's one of the heirs, I guess you could say, or something. And he would tell me that people would come in there with their hang-ups, and they could spend years and years in therapy. But it wasn't until they started actually helping other people that they couldn't get over themselves, and they didn't want to get over themselves. And it's that hope. It's getting back to that theme that we're developing now, I guess, hope. Where do you find it? How do you find it? How do you wake up in the morning and know that the day is going to be okay, and not just okay, but it's worth living. And the dead zombie life that suburbia has created is like a nihilism that has rotted out our social connectivity and the possibility of hope. Because anytime you have homeless people around you in your city, that's guilt. That's on your hands. That's your responsibility. Whether or not they're loathsome or they're lazy or they're sick or whatever, that's part of your humanity. That's who you are. It's a reflection on who you are. I was in the military. I was in a airborne ranger unit. And there was this expression in this unit where we would say, you're only as fast as the slowest guy or slowest member. Mm-hmm. And until we get it into our heads, and it's hard to remind ourselves pedagogically, practically, in a disciplined way, until we get it in our heads that we are that beggar on the street, we are that billionaire in the boardroom. We are all part of this. And how, until we can start to see and feel and believe in that world, we're functioning in a fantasy where we think we are the ones in charge of ourselves. And that's what the market tries to do. It tries to create these commodified subjects that says it's do or die. It's you better kill the other person or defeat them or you will be killed. And that's the thing, getting back to that theological moment of Christianity hitting the scene, it breaks that sense of the law, tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, and opens up that hope. I love that. I mean, when I write my novels, it keeps repeating that same refrain. I get it. Sometimes I get inspired, and sometimes it turns out okay, but most of the time it doesn't. But I would love to think I'm living that life where I'm standing up, fighting for that hope. And even if I die, even if I lose, I will always have won.
Yeah, so maybe there's something to say there between hope and, I don't know, praxis, I guess, right? And if we kind of go back to that nihilism that you mentioned, and maybe this kind of connects in with some of the Milbeck and Zizek stuff, right? Like in radical theological circles, which is sort of where I locate myself, there's a lot of talk on one hand about thinking beyond these sorts of, stupid atheist divisions. But then at the same time, I feel like there's still difficulty in a real practical way articulating how that overcoming can fund a real robust practice or something. And I know it can't be prescriptive or whatever, but like, what's the handle there? Like for someone who still is finding value in transcendence or thinking transcendence, as opposed to someone who's still like a more militant atheist. What's the common ground there for practice that you would want to point to?
Geez, that's a really good question that I think religions have tried to grapple with and come up with their own answers with over time. But it's a real concept also on the level of philosophy or theology. It's a conceptual issue. And for me, I'm still never able to get around the immanent critique of transcendence. Although sometimes it's very beautiful and really good thinkers can get it sometimes. But I still have this issue with that bifurcation that you were mentioning between like transcendence and immanence, because to think already is to invoke the next thought, the next word you have, already is a moment of transcending one's own present position. And Hegel gets this right in his introduction to the phenomenology, where he's like saying, when you say the sentence, there is the tree, but by the time the sentence has any meaning, it doesn't make any sense. The tree is not that tree that you're pointing out because it's changed, and so there's always this kind of play back and forth between this transcending one's own self and immanence, or the secular notion that it's all like. I remember sitting in the Dawkins lectures at Oxford as an undergrad, and I would get into it with him. And one of the things he prides himself on in his position is, you should give your children the ability to be atheists and to disagree with you. Well, I would disagree with him in his lectures, and he would shut me down, like in very dismissive ways. Right. And it's this sort of arrogance, like Sam Harris. People call him a fascist or whatever. I mean, it's just, and I love Terry Eagleton when he glosses this. The Ditchkins, the Dawkins, and what's the other guy? Hitchens. Yeah, the Ditchkins. It's just bad reading. Like, you don't really feel in a good mood when you're finished reading it. Whereas when I read beautiful theology, for whatever reason, it's probably my own sentimentality, but I'm uplifted. I see the world differently. It gives me something different. And I haven't read theology in 5 years. Maybe I should go back and start reading a little bit of that.
Well, Daniel Barber, I think in one of his books, I think it was Delusion and the Naming of God, and I think he teaches at the GCAS sometimes. Yes. I'm actually enrolled in his course on Spinoza right now. But anyway, he wrote in that book where I haven't read the whole thing, but he's talking about trying to overcome this divide between a transcendent and immanent by trying to find transcendence within immanence, I think is what his thesis was. Mm-hmm. And you kind of hit on, he was using Heidegger in the first kind of sections, and then he gets into Deleuze, but this notion of transcendence within the immanence, I think it is found within Hegel himself, right? Because we see that the there and the now are both transcendent categories within the immanent reference of any kind of subject or object we're talking about, right? So, so metaphysically, there has to be something within reality that we're talking about now that's not transcendent, as in a sense of like being over and above reality, but within reality that's able for reality to create new things, to create play, to create difference, the flux, the flow of reality. And this gets into the old pre-Socratics, Parmenides and Heraclitus, where Heraclitus is saying panthere, all is in flux. You never step into the same river twice because it's always moving. But Parmenides is saying being is one, and not being any being or a not being is logically absurd. So it's this old debate that I don't think it's never going to go away.
Well, I like some of the more recent kind of attempts to mediate it. Like at the end of Robbins' book on radical theology, he sort of invokes Malibu's plasticity to sort of not as a corrective per se. So there's a new way for thinking, so that being is change.
Yeah, and that's what I love about the history of philosophy or theology, is that, in the end of the day, there's always different ways of shifting categories and trying to figure these things out. And it's like you invoked Parmenides and Heraclitus, and in modern terms it would Badiou is the Parmenidean and Deleuze is the Heraclitean, right? And it's part of it is beautiful to be part of reading these texts and grappling with this, with in some ways the same questions, but in very different keys and very different tones, and the style. And I love William Desmond, for example, and how he works through Hegel. And where it gets rather boring is the polemic, where he will or she will reduce it down to cardboard, ducky horsey style. I just
ducky horsey.
Yes,
I'm going to use that. I like that.
And that's the Ditchkins thing. It's like the religious are this. They're in this box and they suck, and everyone is reducible down to that category. What I love is opening up categories, and isn't that precisely what? Again, getting back to that moment. I don't know why I'm re-invoking Jesus for like the third or fourth time. Maybe I haven't thought about Jesus in a while, and this is all happening.
You're going to be at church on Sunday. I know it.
But that's the thing. It's like that's that moment of openness that breaks the categories of the symbolic order that through which we understand reality, and that can be exciting. Like oftentimes with GCAS, you get all these interesting, completely obsessed, like super intense people who take themselves way too seriously at age like 16. They think they're the next Heidegger, and they have no sense of humor, and they're just obsessed with getting it right.
There's a will to truth there, isn't there?
Totally a will to truth, right? But isn't it interesting where the greatest learning experiences, I think, in our lives, at least for me and some people that I've known, are those experiences where what Gadamer in Truth and Method will call the being called up short, being surprised by that insight that hits you, like that you can't predict, and it changes the very way you think and how you feel. I just love that. That's
sort of, in a different register for some reason. That's just sort of re-invoking the notion of the event for me. And of course, there's different ways of thinking that, but like one of the things that Zizek points out many times is that, it's easier today to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the world differently, so, and maybe, and kind of connecting back to the idea of hope again, but like, do you think it's possible to have hope today without that hope being tied to like a form of apocalypticism or something like this, where, and this is a tension in my own thinking, on one hand, this hope for a radical change, but on the other, like really hoping to avoid total catastrophe, where people are going to suffer, so is that something that's a concern for you? You spend any time?
Yeah, I remember after September the 11th, and I was driving to teach at James Madison University when this was happening. And I remember, this wave of a whole wave of a new feeling in my body where something wasn't right. And then soon after, my radical friends were like, yeah, let's take the system down. Let's dismantle everything.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're like, yeah, but maybe not. Maybe we just need false consciousness for a little bit longer. And,
Small healthy dose.
Yeah, exactly. You get a glimpse of it, but then you're like, I still like my Starbucks, that's a good question, because for me, hope is something that's like a gift that you don't generate, but it's like a candlelight where you're not the one generating the fuel that burns the wick, but you can see it, and and not always. It comes and it's fleeting, and it's that kind of open glimpse that shines. Okay, to use the metaphor, overly use the metaphor. Sorry, to illuminate the metaphor. Sorry, I couldn't resist. It shines a new way that you didn't consider, and that is still possible. Like a good poem that will give you that inspiration. And at the same time, the structures, it's like the scriptures talk about this, right? I mean, where you always have the poor among you. You always have the rich. You always have exploitation. You always have slaves. But even with all of these things, and capitalism is going to get far worse before it gets better, and so on. And the rise of neo-fascism in the United States and elsewhere, as bad as it can get, and it gets bad, there's still that sense of hope that emerges. And it's that, if you can live by that and be in tune with that, I think that gives you a sense of meaning, and it gives you that sense of connection without destruction. Because I'm a pacifist, I'm nonviolent anarchist. I don't claim to be anything. I hate that, but that, Jacques Ellul. What I'm trying to say is Jacques Ellul. That's a good question, because I always have that tension myself, growing up in a Christian cult, essentially, and that apocalypse was always, Negri. I read he sent me his notes in prison, and I was reading them. They're in Italian. I was reading them, translating them. And, he talks about how religions will use the apocalypse as a means of enslaving minds to an end that ultimately guarantees the subsistence of the church.
Yeah, and I mean, if we don't necessarily, circumscribe that term to the realm of the theological, but just kind of think it purely politically, of course it can have that same effect that you're talking about, so, and it can be, sort of way of controlling, like, this is a foregone conclusion. And I think there's going back to that cynicism or resignation. I think on the left, it's like, we're talking sometimes out of both sides of our mouths. It's like, revolution this, but I don't know, why bother? On the other hand, what I mean?
I'll share with you an incredible experience of mine that anybody who was in the room at the time, about 600 people, we did GCAT. I put on this conference, a Global Center for Advanced Studies conference in Athens in July of 2015. And in that room, we had the panels, we had like 300 people giving papers over the course of 4 days. And it was just in a very volatile time in Greek history, for reasons that maybe I can't explain now for the sake. But at the time, the big debate was, should Greece exit the EU, or should it accept yet another form of bailouts, which further indebts them and enslaves them to the financial institutions? And in that room, I remember Kostas Lasovitsas. He came in and it kind of did an intervention. He came up to me before a panel where you had people like Leo Panich, and you had basically like your left-wing people who were radical to a point, but then wouldn't go far enough. And Lapovica came in, and he came up to me and said, "Hey, I would like to be on this panel." I was like, "Sure." So I went and told the others, hey, Lapavitsa is going to be on this panel. Who is Lapavitsas? He is a professor in London, an economics professor, but he's also was the leader of the left wing in Syriza, the political party that was in power. The first, they came to power, the first left-wing party in power in modern European history. And so he's this radical. And you should go on YouTube and see this. It's incredible because there were fights. People were fighting each other in the audience. And the liberals were like, yeah, but could you imagine if we got out of the EU, there would be a humanitarian crisis, and then it would be the biggest suicide note in the history of the left. And others were like, but if we don't do it now, we'll never do it. And so it gets back to your point of that the apocalypse on the one hand, the fear of everything crashing. At the same time, something new must be. It's some new form of hope. Where do you find that? And I find that doing an educational project is not a political party, but we're able to be a catalyst between the protesters and not a political party. Somewhere that does something different, that doesn't register itself in traditional term.
But like that idea of what comes next, it's still an open question, and like this is something that when I talk to some of my more moderate friends on the right and the left, sometimes I hear this claim that what we really need to do is just return to kind of liberalism as such, like, okay, globalism has failed. Let's just, put our houses back in order. We're going to reinforce, the separation between religion and politics. We're going to put the economy back in its proper place. And like, it's sort of like, let's make liberalism great again. As though what we're seeing today is like the result of some external problem, not necessarily a result of contradictions within liberalism itself. But I don't know. Do you think that's even possible? Can we go back? Can we go back there?
I mean, isn't that Bernie? I love Bernie Sanders, right? But isn't that? If Bernie Sanders was running for a political office in the 60s, he wouldn't be seen as radical. He'd be seen as a normal Democrat.
Yeah.
And, but it's a good question. I mean, like from my experiences of just traveling the past 5 years doing this school, I've come up with this. My belief is that you really can't change or get behind something that claims to change everything. Like, let's go back to liberalism. Which is an interesting contradiction because anytime you talk about going back, it's a conservative move. Let's go back to the golden age, right? And so for me, I would love to be able to live on a farm, own the means of production by milking the sheep and cows, and teaching awesome classes and writing.
Sign me up.
Well, I'm working on it. It might take a couple more years, but so it's rather than think about it on a global scale. Like, how do we change things? Well, liberalism is the answer, or neoliberalism, or fascism is the answer, or communism is the answer. In the end, it's a question of like, how can you simplify and live decently with each other and faithfully to the sustainability of our planet?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's if you could solve that, that's a great way of life.
Well, that's also a work of practice too, because I have political and activist and organizing friends locally who don't want to think about national politics right now. They want all the organizing, all the radical changes from their perspective is coming through the local politics and even just local community building, gaining power at the local level by organizing your neighbors into a tenants union, or running for city council, or something along those lines. Something smaller scale. And it reminds me of Hart and Negri's notion of the multitude, where it's not this big overarching schema directed from the top that's going to kind of change the world, like you're saying, communism, fascism, whatever, neoliberalism, whatever. It's actually something from below, from the multitude, the people who are at the bottom, who are making these everyday decisions to think and act radically. And that doesn't mean necessarily tearing stuff down or blowing stuff up like you were talking about earlier, because that's that's a little bit frightening for a lot of people, for most people I would say. But it could just be simply changing the way we think about our neighbor, right? And that's the theological notion in itself, because love your neighbor as yourself is something I think I remember some some religious figure said at one point, right? Yeah.
But having the time to engage in politics at that level, to that extent that you're talking about, I think presupposes that, and this goes back to maybe one of the reasons why you started GCAS. I mean, with the indebtedness of students sort of prohibits that. Before you jumped on Creston, like Preston was dropping these stats on me that I wasn't aware of. Like, what did you say? How many trillions?
Just from Creston's article in Truth Out about a student debt loan. The aggregate student debt amount in the United States is $1.5 trillion, which is actually not just below, but it's below the home mortgage. But it's other than that, it's like the highest aggregate amount of debt that people hold. Like, it's more than credit cards, it's more than like car loans, all of that stuff. And I think it's like tens of millions of people from all different age categories are in debt. So there are people in their 50s and 60s still paying off. I mean, I'll probably be in my 60s unless I get a nice job, paying off my student debts for getting 2 degrees, a master's degree and a bachelor's degree.
Well, it's really cool to talk to you two through this, and I really want to thank you for talking with me. It's when I do this work, it's lonely work sometimes, and you connect through virtual spaces like this a lot, and that's a good thing. I think that's better than not, but at the same time, there's a kind of absence of fellowship and of being around people that you miss. And but it was funny because there's kind of nostalgic moments when I'm talking with you both about being part of a Christian community and what that meant, and how my life was all happy and perfect in some way. I was a professor, was at Christian communities, but at the same time, the radicality of the gospel and what it calls you to doesn't mean you have to destroy your life. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you should be uncritical and you should just simply pay your bills and buy the next toy for your kid the next Christmas. There's this sense of balance that I think the church, the language of the church and the community doesn't fight enough for. It either is this kind of mainstream liberal community, or it's this conservative community, but the dialogue aren't challenging enough for us to figure out ways of really living a kind of radical Christian life, but without selling everything and giving up hope. There's a weird inversion of this radical nature of Christianity, where you can take it literally and be a nihilist. Actually, a good example of what I mean here of living out a good balance in some ways, like my friend Shane Claiborne. Do you know Shane Claiborne?
Familiar with him, yeah.
Yeah, The Simple Way. I mean, what he's done is an amazing project, and he's an extraordinary person. But it's not like everybody has to do it. And I think some of our young Christians, they feel like if they're not out there giving everything away, they're not Christians. At the same time, so I'm trying to figure out this balance. And I don't know, doing GCAS, it definitely took all of my life, giving up job offers at really good places to do this on nothing. And at the same time, it's not what everyone's called to do. Right. I just couldn't be happy being a professor in a posh environment, teaching the same damn classes over and over again under that condition. I just can't. And that doesn't mean that other professors shouldn't. A lot of times I come across as like this polemical, like if you're a professor teaching at university, you're part of the problem. And I think we all have to deal with our own trials in our own ways as best we can.
Yeah. So if people wanted more information about GCAS, where would you direct them?
Yeah, they can go on our website at the GCAS.org, THEGCAS.org, and they could schedule an appointment with me and we can talk. You should think about doing a degree with us. It's a couple $1,000, and you learn with amazing people from Luca Rigori to Badiou. Zizek's taught with me in Cincinnati a couple years ago. So yeah, they can call me up and we can talk, and they can get to know people in a community and figure out their resources, like their research goals, what they want in life, how does their reading list relate to making them happy, to connecting up with vexing problems about the world without being panicked about it, like sort of soberly working through it, and so figuring out a balance.
Well, you're definitely going to be at church this Sunday.
Well, amen to that, I guess. I would love, actually, kind of speaking, so you can cut this part out, but speaking personally,